Hey guys, I'm E, and here's the thing. Slow motion is a big part of sports videography. And recently in our sports videography community on Facebook, I noticed a lot of confusion around slow motion. Specifically, how to film in slow motion and how to edit your footage to get the best results. For example, a lot of people think that anything they film with a DSLR camera can just be slowed down in editing and look like this. When in reality, if you don't know what you're doing, it's most likely gonna look like that. So in this video, I'm going to explain how to film and how to edit perfect slow motion footage for your sports videos. Okay, first off, to understand how slow motion works, you need to understand frame rates, because the key factor is going to be filming with the right frame rate. So I'm about to get a bit technical here, but don't worry, I'm going to keep it as simple and quick as possible.
Teach me. I can do it.
The frame rate is the number of frames or images per second in your footage. Some people film in 24 frames per second, some people film in 25 frames per second, 30, 50, 60, 100, 120, and most people don't even know where these numbers come from and why they exist. So let me tell you why. First and foremost, you need to understand the difference between the NTSC standard and the PAL standard. Because in your camera settings, there's a menu allowing you to choose between the two, and you need to get it right. It all has to do with the way the electrical power is generated in your country. If you live in North America or in a few other places that you can look up online, that means you live in a country where the electrical current is at a 60 Hz frequency, and therefore your camera should be set to NTSC, which includes frame rates like 30 frames per second, 60, 120, and so on. Now, if you live in most of Europe or in Asia, or in my case, Australia, that means you live in a country where the electrical current is at a 50 Hz frequency and your camera should be set to PAL, which includes frame rates like 25 frames per second, 50, 100, and so on. Now, why does that matter? Because most of the lights around us constantly flicker on and off. So we use a 50 or a 60 Hz frequency because at those frequencies, the flickering, although still present, goes unnoticed by the human eye. The key word here being human, because the camera's eye, aka the sensor, can still see the flicker. For example, a couple of months ago when I went to Vegas to film UFC 246, I completely forgot to switch my camera from PAL to NTSC and shot everything in either 25 or 50 frames per second. While I was seeing a clean, flicker-free image in my viewfinder, the camera itself was seeing something a little different, which only became visible to me once I played back the footage on my computer like I am now. But if I had remembered to change my settings to NTSC, my camera would have been synchronized with the 60 Hz frequency of the lighting, which basically means that I wouldn't have any flickering in my footage. So here's the thing. The reason I'm telling you all this is for you to understand that the first thing you should do before filming anything is make sure your camera is set to the right standard. This is especially important if you're filming in a basketball gym or in a hockey arena, because these venues are typically full of huge lights that will create very obvious flickering in your footage if you're using the wrong settings. So if like me you set your camera to PAL, then you have the option of filming in 25, 50 or 100 frames per second. But those options only come with rather expensive cameras. If you got a cheaper model, most likely you won't have the option to film in 100 frames per second. And if you have an even cheaper model, a more basic one, you might not even have the option to film in 50 frames per second. And if that's the case for you and you're stuck filming in either 25 or 30 frames per second, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your slow motion footage will never be perfect. The reason why that is that the human eye needs at least 23 images per second to be fooled into thinking that it's watching real-time action. If you go lower than that, let's say 15 frames per second for example, which I'll show you by using this effect, you'll very easily notice that the footage when I play it back looks a bit choppy. And that's because there's not enough images or frames per second. So if you're working like me on a 25 frames per second video using 25 frames per second footage, when you slow down a clip to say 50% of its original speed, you now have a clip that is showing only 12.5 frames per second and will inevitably look much choppier than it did before. Am I making any sense so far? If not, please use the comment section to ask me any question that comes to mind, because I'm not a teacher, I'm not a coach or anything like that, so I can only imagine how confused some of you must already be. So if you want to produce perfectly smooth and sharp looking slow motion footage, here's what you need to do. First, you need to film your footage in a frame rate that is at least double the frame rate of your final video. That means that if you're filming in 50 frames per second like me, your editing sequence or timeline needs to be at 25 frames per second. That way, you can slow a clip down to 50% of its original speed and it will still show 25 frames per second and therefore look silky smooth. And if you film at 100 frames per second like I did here with my GoPro Hero 6, that means you can slow your clip all the way down to 25% of its original speed and still not lose any quality. For my American friends and fellow Canadians who want to achieve the same result, all you need to do is film in either 60 or 120 frames per second while editing in a 30 frames per second sequence, and you too will be able to produce videos like this one. Now just a few extra tips before I finish this video. There's also a 24 frames per second option that I haven't mentioned yet. I did that to keep things simple. But basically 24 frames per second is the frame rate used to film movies. So if you use it, your footage will have a slightly more cinematic look, but you still won't be able to slow your footage down without losing quality. Also, if you are filming in 24, 25 or 30 frames per second and you decide to slow down your footage anyway, let me show you how to do it in Premiere Pro in a way that won't damage your footage too much. When you change the speed of a clip, make sure you also change the time interpolation menu to optical flow. I'm not sure how it works to be honest, but it does give you a slightly better result.
At least challenge him on the shot. Ingles lets another one fly, and down it goes.
And lastly, when playing around with frame rates, you also need to be conscious of your shutter speed. I won't go into great details about shutter speed because it could and should be a whole video within itself, but basically if your shutter speed is too low, you'll end up with too much motion blur, and if it's too high, any motion will appear very jerky. So the basic rule for most natural looking motion blur is to set your shutter speed at double your frame rate. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful to at least some of you, and also don't forget that you can always reach out to me on Facebook in a group called Sports Videography Community. It's the perfect place to connect with sports videographers of all levels from all over the world. So on that note, be safe and I'll see you guys soon.